Dear Lord, thank you so much for this beautiful day. Thank you for the cold weather outside. Thank you that we can all be here in this warmth. And not just the warmth of the heat coming out of the vents, but the warmth of the people in this room and the love that we have for each other and the relationships that we share. I pray that those relationships will sustain us all week as we go out and show your love to others. Be with us, guide us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Sometimes we don't talk enough about the relationship of God and women and what women can do, what women have had an effect on us. Most of us have had somebody who taught us as children, as was being asked today. And those women really affected us as we were growing up. And there are a lot of women who can continue to have that effect on people as they're adults. And one of my good friends came to ACU when I was there. I had spent some time in Botswana and South Africa, so when Arlene and her husband David came to Abilene for David to do graduate work and for Arlene to finish her undergraduate, we became fast friends just talking about things from South Africa. A love for appetizer and tea with cream and sugar in it and different things that we connected with. But one of the things I loved about Arlene was her faith. And Arlene, even though they came for David to go to graduate school and get his degree in ministry, Arlene has traveled the world as a spokesperson, as an avenue for God to speak through her about women and their relationship to God and the church in general. And she has such a wide variety of experiences and knowledge, but it comes from her faith in God. And I wanted her to share today. And so, Arlene, come on.
Usually like to start out by doing the disclaimer about my accent. When I moved to Abilene in 91, I sounded very British. I come from a province in South Africa that's very English. And 26, whatever it is, years in West Texas, I sound Australian. What I've managed to do is keep the flat intonation of a South African and combine it with West Texas elongated vowels. And so I say words like Bible. And I'm like, where did that come from? So yeah, I seem to have been able to pick up the worst of both and put them together, and this is what you have. So if there is something that I say, or I say it too quickly and you need me to do a redo, just wave and say, what'd you say? And I'm happy to repeat it. But yes, I've known Richard really since I got to America. We have traveled many roads together, and it's a relationship that I'm thankful for, and certainly count several others of you in this room significant to me. Terry has been an influence over our lives for a long time, and I'm thankful that I get to be here today. This is us. It's an interesting topic, and I want to start by telling you a couple stories. These are my people that I call family. My daughter, who is my mini-me, is 22, and she's about to finish at ACU and take herself off to graduate school in the UK. Not sure I'm totally ready for that, but she's ready. My son Spencer is 17, and he looks like he's 35. It's a musical theatrical family, and that's sort of what they love to do. My husband David was in congregational ministry for around 22 years. He is now, we moved back to Abilene for a non-ministry job, which is really unusual. He's doing HR and is on the cusp of opening a new brewery with some friends. So he's an avid home brewer. Those are my people. I come from South Africa, and if you don't hear anything else today, if you will leave knowing that Africa is a continent and South Africa is a country, we all win. We all win. Occasionally I get to go speak to school groups, and it's kind of funny. I always tell students, if you can just know that there are multiple countries in Africa, I feel like I'll count it as a win. South Africa's southernmost tip, and I come from a city on the eastern coast called Durban. Grew up in Pietermaritzburg, and now I call Cape Town home because that's where our remaining family lives. If you ever want to travel, that's the place to go. The next picture, that is Durban. That's my home. That's where I was born. And the next picture is Pietermaritzburg, known for lots of trees. That's where I spent my high school years. And the next picture is Cape Town, that we now call home, and some of us call paradise. It's pretty fantastic. I grew up in a home with an Italian dad and a Jewish mother. So we processed emotions through food and lots of hand motions. There were not very many quiet days. This girl here lost her Italian dad when she was 11 years old. And that is something that it is not an exaggeration or overdramatic to say I think about him every single day. And that is almost 40 years ago. The next picture, my parents, and that'll give you a good indication, Italian dad, Jewish mother. I want to stop there for a second. So growing up, I grew up in a family that my mother had been raised in a Jewish home that really was secular, celebrated a couple of holidays. That was a pragmatic thing, more than a faith-induced ceremony. My dad he went to Catholic church a couple times a year, but was certainly, they were not a church-attending family. We met some missionaries, and I can tell you that my story of walking with Jesus is the direct result of missions. Several missionary families settled in the home city where I was growing up, and through a long story that's too much to tell you in this venue, met my family, and my family became Christian, and the trajectory of our life changed. Those same families, there were 5 of them on a mission team, they have stayed significant to our family. Their adult children are still my friends. We're scattered around the world, but they became important then. They kept pouring in and investing, and for many reasons, I count the kinds of seeds that they planted in our lives, the reason we are where we are now. The downside to that same story is 4 out of those 5 families are no longer intact, and their adult children are no longer children of faith for multiple reasons, and very understandable ones. But that did not go unnoticed by me, and as I was going into young adulthood, I started really seeing the cost of missions on families, what poor mission preparation looks like. We were a fortunate situation where we had a team. Most places had missionaries sent to far corners of the world, unprepared and alone. And mission work is hard and complicated and isolating, and the lack of support to hold that up takes a toll on families. And so I watched these precious, dear friends of mine struggle and still struggle as a result of a sacrifice that they made. I want you to take that and put it on a hook, because we're going to come back to that point. Alongside this, I'm growing up in a country that you probably know best for the years of segregation and apartheid. And I was born in 1967, which means I was in elementary school during the times in South Africa that were the most unstable and politically, what is the word I'm looking for? They were awful. They were awful. Racism as an institutional system was law by the government. And at the time when you're living in the middle of that, you don't know. You do not understand. I was very blessed that my family sent me to a private school for my kindergarten through 8th grade years. And in South Africa at the time, private education was not the same thing that it was here at the time. It wasn't a bastion for whiteness where people shipped their kids somewhere in the northeast so that you could live secluded. In South Africa, it was the way that you could actually get an education in a multicultural situation because the government had no say over the school. So I went to a school from little bitty through 8th grade with students who were different to me. I went to school with students that were black and that were Indian or from other racial groups, and that was unusual at the time. And there's no way for me to measure the gift that was, because I started connecting with kids that were just like me, whose parents were usually in clergy or in politics and maybe in exile in another African country, but they still wanted their child to be educated in a school system that was as good as ours was, so they were at a boarding school. I went to a boarding school, but I was a day student, so there were a few of us that didn't actually stay. In that time, I got to meet these kids who started telling me the real story of what was happening in our country. And I remember even as a young child, it literally tearing me apart. We lived in a time of great propaganda and immense censorship in South Africa. The government controlled the newspapers and controlled any TV sources. And so we were given a message of one thing, and I was having face-to-face experience with students who were telling me something else. And I got to love and admire and delight in the presence of people that were different to me, and not experience the thing where equality is sameness, but equality is the ability to appreciate the difference and honor the difference. Not trying to level the playing ground, but trying to honor the person that you are, the way you are. And so my dad dies right before I turned 12, and it's a big shift for my parents, for our family life. My brother is 11 years older, and he'd already left home. My mom and I embark on a new way of doing life together. And she takes a full-time job for the first time, and she works as sort of a missionary care person for a preacher training school in South Africa that is training preachers who are out in the field. And they're native Zulu preachers. And so this girl, whose world has already been bust open and is unlike her peers because she's having these incredible experiences getting to know black students her own age and is realizing all the issues at stake in her country, now has the ability to start to meet these influential, amazing native Zulu black preachers in South Africa. And because my mother is doing the missionary care and she's working out of her house, they're coming to our home. And that's unusual at the time. And so Samson Peters, this older gentleman with the sort of pea coat, he would come into town and come over to the flat, and kids make tea in South Africa. A parent doesn't even have to ask. A guest comes in, the child goes to the kitchen, puts the kettle on, sets the tray, brings the tea. And so here I was doing something in the time that it doesn't seem remarkable now, but I was being trained to serve people that were different to me in a culture that didn't honor difference. And Samson, I think, could pick up something in me that was already stirring, and he started giving me books to read. And I don't know if my mother ever knew, but several books that he gave me to read had been banned in South Africa. But they were about racial struggle and equality, and I started to read and just delight in what I was reading, and he continued to shape me. And the middle character in this picture is a gentleman named Jerome, an incredible preacher, and he started doing the same. And so my life took on this shaping by these two formational individuals who were standing in for my dad in many ways and giving me gifts that I didn't even realize. Side note, and this is completely free, is it not amazing how much Samson looks like Sir Sidney Poitier? Isn't it? Like, I look at him now and I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that at the time. Anyway, incredible influences on my life. Hang that on a hook, and we're going to come back to that. So we've got missions on a hook and racial equality on a hook. Arlene continues her life, and I become a travel agent, and then my husband gets a wild hair that we're going to go to Abilene Christian University in the armpit of Texas and become ministers. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me, right? But he wasn't. So we move over there, and I soon learn that Abilene is wonderful, and the people certainly do make the place. But we go through this ministry training, and we take a first job in Coppell at the Riverside Church of Christ and spend almost 6 years here in the Metroplex, and it's wonderful. And then one of David's friends takes a preaching position in Amarillo, Texas, and calls and says, you should come and join me here. And again, for some reason, David thought that was a great idea, and I thought Abilene was bad. The moment I flew into Amarillo, I thought, ooh. Anyway, we did that. And 11 years later, it was hard to leave Amarillo, Texas, but we did. And we moved back to Abilene 5 years ago. So that's sort of the overview of that life story, at least the timeline. While we're in Amarillo, I got a call one day from a mentor that I'd had in college, and she said, would you join a ministry and travel with us to renew, equip, build up women in ministry on the mission field? And I jumped at the opportunity, and it was a trip to Russia. And I thought, absolutely, yes, I want to do this. And it did not come together for me to go. And I was devastated, absolutely devastated. And I thought, that's it. God gave me my chance. I couldn't do it. It's never going to come around again. And in retrospect, I think it was one of those things that I had to lay down and say no to in order for it to come back around. Have you had one of those before? Maybe you want something so badly. And so that was a no. And I got comfortable in my skin with that being a no eventually. And then it came back around again, about a year later. And everything opened for me to go, and I went. And it started the most beautiful cycle of pouring into people and people pouring back into me. Getting to travel with a strong team of women on Come Before Winter, which is a ministry based out of Austin, and go around the world, teach the text seriously to women who are wanting to be equipped for Bible study, that they can then take that in turn and teach the people that they impact the most. And Come Before Winter took me from Thailand to Papua New Guinea to New Zealand to Australia, all the way through Europe to Peru and Panama, all the way through Honduras, Nicaragua, Roatan. I mean, I'm out of country names. It's taken me all around the world, meeting women, doing ministry, some of them in full-time ministry, some of them wives of ministers, some of them NGO workers, human trafficking workers, people who are working to empower small communities and places. The most incredible people on the planet, getting to sit face-to-face with them and talk text, but also pray together and listen to their hearts and be a safe place, because I know I get on an airplane in a week and I fly away. And they can say things to me that they can't say to their teammates, or they can't say in a newsletter to a home church, because then people get antsy, but they can say it to a stranger and trust that confidentiality, and we fly away. So God in his sweetness gives me this opportunity to unhook the gift that was given to me through missionary families, and to then, however many years later, to start pouring back into this very thing that has changed the trajectory of my life. And around the same time, a professor at ACU starts dedicating a lot of his lifetime money and ministry to racial reconciliation in churches, and starts asking questions like, what will it look like in our country if reconciliation rises up through churches? And he hears me speak at another event about an African theological concept called Ubuntu. And if you need a series after this, I suggest you do that one. This beautiful understanding of I value you, your humanity, and you value mine, and I'm made more full when I value who you are. And together we go through life. Beautiful theology. And so I'm speaking about Ubuntu, and Dr. Jerry Taylor comes and says, hey, can we combine forces and do this thing with racial reconciliation? And I'm like, yes, we can. Yes, my whole life has led to this. And so we do these things around the States over about an 18-month period. And all of a sudden, I'm getting to sit face-to-face at a table with a mom who's got a son the same age that I have. And we can compare notes, and I'm just uncomfortable and kind of crawling in my white privilege as I sit here realizing I've never had to say to my son the things you're saying to your son. And shame on us. And so I start realizing the conversation needs to be about not resources, but access. You know, we can sit at a table together and debate, I grew up poorer than you did, I grew up in a worse neighborhood. Well, that's not the conversation. The conversation is who has a voice simply because they show up. And so we start doing these beautiful things around the country and seeing Christians rise up and get motivated to say, I want to make a difference. And I want the church to be the one that's leading the way. And I grew up in a country where the church was the one that was leading the way in oppression. And so God in his sweetness unhooks this racial thing and gives that back in a whole different way. And so who knew the calling of my life would land up being pouring back into missionaries and getting to speak to racial reconciliation? I sure didn't. And so I'm super thankful for that. And so that's a little bit of background about me, and probably more than you wanted. But all of that background leads to something. And it leads to your theme of This Is Us. Because I think the thing that I discovered is all around the world, meeting with all different kinds of people, talking about all different sorts of topics, there's a couple of things that we have in common. And that, again, is not just sameness, it's about commonality of experience. And I've thought about how to talk about those things, and I could throw them out, but I don't want this to sound like some mental health conversation, because we could be talking therapy or mental health things, but it's more than that. And so I've reached for Exodus to talk about this, because I want it to come from text, not as proof texting, but as conversation, because I think nothing points more clearly to the character and nature of God than the narrative in Exodus. Not to read it, to take a passage and stick it on your life like a Band-Aid and say, look here, text says this. But to say, when we read narrative and we learn who God is, we somehow get our stories connected with that. And there's power there. Richard, how long do I have still? No, it's 11:10. I'll honor the time, but I just need to know. I've got to put my glasses on. Okay. So we're talking Exodus, and I keep thinking, what are the things that I'm hearing that are the same? And the first thing, without a doubt, that I hear, whether it's stateside or internationally, none of us feel equipped or ready for the call. I've never met anybody who does, well, actually, that's not true. I've never met anybody doing ministry that's real kingdom ministry that has ever felt ready and equipped for the calling that has been put on their heart. And every time I have met somebody who feels completely equipped and ready for whatever it is that God has for them, I get a little anxious, honestly. Biblically, I think it's interesting that God calls people and they're generally afraid, terrified. And then there's this sort of yes that happens, and it's never really a confident yes, it's a yes. And then there's abject fear, and they tend to flee. And then sometimes at the end of their fleeing, there's a big fish. You know, I mean, however it looks, very few people hear the calling, step and say yes confidently, and everything goes great. People that I meet, nobody feels completely ready for the call that they have received. And I love that, because I feel like God always does his best work in wounded people. And he uses unexpected people in unexpected places to do unexpected things. And that is his plan, because it's about the work that he's already doing that we join in through us. And so if we're talking Exodus, I think it's significant to look at Exodus chapter 3. And if you have got a phone with a text on it or a Bible in front of you, whatever, if you want to turn there, great. If not, no biggie. Exodus 3:1. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock, and this is my favorite, to the far side of the wilderness. And God finds him, to the far side of the wilderness. He was not ready. It doesn't get any better when they're having the interaction and there's a burning bush. And Moses says to God in 11, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God continues to make a case. And I love envisioning that interaction, because I think it must have been really rich. Thanks for the invitation. No, thanks. You really are my person. I don't think so. What if we do it this way? Yeah, great idea, but. And so that sounds very much like the way most of us do life, We don't feel ready for what it is, and that's not the worst thing. But I think the trick is less about being ready for the actual calling and being ready to be faithful in the small things. Being ready to be faithful in whatever the next thing is that's put before us, the very next thing. And there's another and lovely, just beautiful throwaway line that I think we miss in Exodus 33. I'm sorry that I'm buzzing here, but it's my hair probably. Exodus 33. I should have had this prepared, but I didn't plan to talk about this little one. 33:11. I love this line. The Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. Then Moses would return to the camp, but his young aide Joshua, son of Nun, did not leave the tent. Have you ever thought about that line before? It's the tent of meeting. Joshua is posted there, and he never leaves the tent. I don't know what happened in the lead up to that appointment. I don't know if someone says to Joshua, You look strong. You look like you could stand a long time. There's a tent. Go and stand. Joshua stands at the tent. I don't know if they say to him, you may not leave, or if he's overhearing things that are so significant that are happening here that he doesn't want to leave. I don't know. I don't know if being appointed the tent stander is something of consequence. I don't know if that makes him feel useful. I don't know if it's the schleppy job in the camp. Like, who knows? But he stands at the tent and doesn't leave. What do we know is coming next? Anybody? What's coming next for Joshua? Exactly. I don't think as the tent stander, he had any idea what was coming next. But he was faithful in the small things. And there may have been a moment where Joshua would have thought, well, I'm kind of the scrawny one in the group. What about the strong guy? If I'm picking someone to stand at the tent and my choice is Arlene or Ryan, I'm telling you, I'm going with Ryan. Because he's strong, you know? Who knows what Joshua thought? But responded to the call with the small thing and was faithful in the small thing. And God does incredible things with that. And so, number one, nobody that I ever meet who is in the middle of the hard kingdom work has ever felt like they were the one that should be doing it, but they just said the yes in abject fear. The second thing, God sometimes seems silent. That's been true for me. And if you've been, I think, a Jesus follower longer than about 12 minutes, it's probably true for you. God sometimes seems silent. And Exodus draws us back to that too. A people who assumed that God was absent, that God had left them. Their perception was, God has left me. And for 400 years, they didn't feel like they heard anything. I'm going to guess that after 400 years, and how many generations would that be? 6, 7? Okay. All these generations of people. This people of God look a whole lot more like Egyptians than they do what we would imagine a people of God. So there's the sense of God is silent, God isn't speaking. What do we do? Is he even hearing our cry? And then you read passages in Exodus where you do know that God has heard the cry of his people and is now ready to act and move. And when God is ready to act and move, he acts and moves. Does it bring up a whole lot of questions about why did it take so long? Why aren't you responding? Could you not have said, heard you, not yet? Like, was there a different way to handle this, maybe? And so we wonder about that. Sometimes God seems silent. If you read a little further in your text and you read the way the Psalms are gathered in the Psalter, it's interesting to me that we have this sense of, while the people are in exile, they feel like God has abandoned them again, and there's silence. It's like, where are you? Why are you not fixing this? I like to call Walter Brueggemann my theological academic crush, and I'm not sure how he would feel about that, but we'll just keep that here. He writes this beautiful understanding of Psalms in one of his works where he talks about the way the Psalms are divided into 3 sections. There are Psalms of orientation, there are Psalms of disorientation, and there are Psalms of reorientation. It's kind of like life, I think. If somebody was writing a prescription for life, there's times of orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. I think one of the best ways to put meat on flesh on that is if you think of the word love. In a time of orientation, you can say, I love you. And that can be true and real and an absolute reflection on your interaction. Then you have moments of disorientation where nothing is as one would have imagined. And in those moments, you may be having to pick the I love you, or you may have to choose to say words of affirmation, or just choose not to throat punch somebody. You've in this place of everything is disoriented, not how intended, and I'm not sure I can get past this. Then there's a moment of reorientation. And if you've experienced grace on a relationship here that's somehow restored, and not all of us have, and they will continually not be restored. But if you've come through disorientation to reorientation in that relationship and you speak I love you here, can you agree with me that the I love you here has rootedness that the I love you here doesn't have? Because this I love you has not been tested by the fire. Right, okay? And I think that is what we read so often in the Psalms is everything's going well for about a psalm and a half. And then this next big section of like, God has left me, I'm alone, nobody hears me, woe is me, And then all of a sudden when it winds back and they reflect back on their experience, they're able to say, wow, you were not angry forever. You didn't keep your love from me. Your love reaches 1,000 generations and your discipline is a limited amount of time. This has got rootedness that this doesn't have. And so that sense of there are times when God is silent, I think there are. We could be summer Christians and say, oh, that's never true. God is always active and doing things actively in your life. And I think it's a lie. There are times when it's silent and it sure feels that way. And then once we navigate through that and we hit that place of expectation and experience bump up against each other and it's icky. And then you figure out what you truly believe here. When you walk this side, that silence has different meaning. And so with the people that I've sat across the table with, stateside and the ones across the world, I think I'd hear them all say, I'm not really ready for this call. And sometimes it feels really, really quiet from the one who shouldn't be quiet. And the third thing is the reflection on, is this all there is? Donald Miller does a great job of exploring that question in the book, Searching for God Knows What. But I think as believers, we get to places in our life where we start saying, surely there's more? Is this all there is? And I think what our question is below, surely there's more, is the longing for intimacy with the Lord. I think that's what we're looking for. We're looking to take a relationship that's stagnant and we're looking to bump it up a notch. And if I'm going to reach for Exodus again, I'm going to reach for Exodus 33 and probably into 34, about verse 10. Because the Moses that we met in chapter 3 is very much like, cool invitation, God, no thanks. And then the Moses we meet in 33, just 30 chapters later, is a completely different story. Here God is saying, I'm so mad with you people, I think I might eat you. I'm going to choose not to be in your presence, so go ahead and do your thing without me because it would be better for all involved. And Moses turns around and says, if you're not going to come with us, don't even send me. I don't want to go. We've got a God and a leader being formed together in such a way that all of a sudden this Moses who's here now is in a place that's saying, hold on a minute, we need to talk about this. You made some promises and you need to keep them. A kind of intimate exchange that if you haven't read Exodus in a while, write that down to reflect on that week. Chapter 33 through 34:10. Beautiful. Where God is able to say to Moses, I'm so mad with these people, go alone. Moses says, come with us, otherwise none of us go. And then sort of does this, reminds me of my Jewish mother, this sort of thing where he says, how, well, if we do go, how will people know we're yours? And starts this sort of weird leverage game with God about saying, come on, you said you'd come with us, and if you're not going to come with us, tell us who is, or let's remember who you are and who we are, come with us. And then the conversation turns, and God says, I know you as a friend. You have found favor in me, and I do want to do what you want. And then Moses does this beautiful thing of, well, if I have found favor with you, then, and puts some things on the table, and God meets those requests. Okay, I'll go with you. What is the deepest desire of your heart? Actually, to be in your glory, to see your glory. And God's like, not the greatest plan for both of us, but this is how I can meet that for you. There's this space. I can put you in that. I can shield you. You can get what you want, and I can be present with you. I read that section of scripture, and I am blown away because that's the relationship I want with the Lord. It's intimate, and it's true and real. And I think we're living in a time where authenticity has been redefined as spewing our icky all over people. In Christian circles, all of a sudden, what's trendy is if we can talk about how broken and wounded we are. And unless you are a mess, it's like you're less spiritual. So we now delight in our mess, and we delight in our brokenness, and we delight in our woundedness, and that's now called authenticity. And I think we've redefined a word in a bad way, and I understand why we have, because we're overcorrecting from perfectionism and works righteousness. We don't want that, so we've become way over here, and now we kind of congregate and talk about our messiness as if this is the most beautiful thing, versus saying, I am a mess, but I also have the same spirit in me that raised Jesus from the dead, and I'm going to walk in that, you know? So in this situation, I think it's really interesting that we have this true authenticity, and true authenticity looks like intimacy, where it's honest, but sort of delighting in the glory of God at the same time, and claiming something that's been promised. God made the promise, and Moses calls him on it, and it's beautiful. And so I hope that you resonate with those three things, because I think that's true about what is true about us. This is us. We are all a people who don't really feel equipped to answer the calls, so we can be faithful in the small things. We are a people who struggle sometimes and feel like God is silent. But if we'll step into the silence and just be okay there, I think we come out reoriented. And I think we are a people who ask often, like, is this all there is? And let's rehear that question as, what I'm really longing for is intimacy with you. And regardless of your ministry or the way that you're living, what you're doing at work or whatever it is, there is something that I think we can all be. And I want to read this little passage, and then I will stop, because I have kept you longer than you needed to. And there we go, I did mark it. This is one of my favorite books over the recent few years. Ian Morgan Crone wrote this book, Jesus, My Father, the CIA and Me. It's brilliant. And he tells a little story here. And he says, the group of first graders receiving the Eucharist for the first time gathered in the narthex of the church. Remember, Dickie Carter whispered as he was being lined up, don't let the Eucharist fall off your tongue or we're all dead. And he dragged his index finger across his throat. This did not help soothe an already quaking queue of 8-year-olds. The procession commenced when the organ music began, and the soloist started singing Ave Maria with a vibrato that could have been picked up on a police radar. First down the nave came the priests carrying these brass balls on chains, and they swung them forward and back, and smoke from smoldering myrrh and incense poured from their vents. Then came the ministers with lighted candles, and there was a cross with a broken body of Jesus. Behind them was the lector who carried the book of the Gospels high above his head. Father Duncan and the other parish priests and deacons came next, and then us in our school uniforms and white dresses. Still terrified. Bishop Dalrymple followed in his blue and silver embroidered cope and mitre, carrying a cross. Plus he had an ornate staff hooked at one end to look like a shepherd's crook. He turned it side to side, repeatedly making the sign of the cross over the congregation. As he passed, men and women, young and old, rich and poor, bowed and received the blessing. I remember nothing of the Mass itself, neither the prayers nor the homily. I only remember the picture of the Virgin Mary draped in a blue robe. As we walked past, her smile was warm, and her brown eyes in the picture made my throat tighten, and I began to cry. I wasn't sure why. I wiped away my tears. Dickie Carter, helpful soul that he was, looked around as if afraid that my crying could somehow get him into trouble. "Why are you bawling?" he whispered. "Shut up," I said, wiping my runny nose with my sleeve on my uniform. The closer we came to the altar and bishop, the more difficult it became for me to not completely lose it. I looked at the aisle where my family was sitting, and saw that my father was missing. I wasn't surprised. The magician David Copperfield couldn't compete with my dad when it came to putting up disappearing acts. It wasn't until I was within 4 or 5 kids of the bishop that I could really see his face. He was corpulent. His cheeks and jowls glazed with perspiration, and he was lightly wheezing like Kip Merriweather, a kid in our class who had asthma. The bishop looked like he would have paid $100 to get out of his clericals, go home, pop open a beer, put his feet up, and watch a Notre Dame basketball game. As I stepped forward and stood before him, he saw the tears running down my cheeks. For an instant, his pasty white face softened, his eyes sparkled just like the Virgin Mary's, and the corners of his mouth turned upward in a smile of deep knowing. I suspect that he knew that I was one of those strange kids who got it, who was hungry and thirsty for God, who longed to be full. Maybe he'd been one of those weird kids too. He placed the host on my tongue and put his hand on the side of my face. His fat thumb briefly massaged my temple, a gesture of blessing I did not see him offer to any of my other classmates, and I fell into God. I've spent 40 years living the result of that moment. I'm told that in years past, when a blizzard hit the Great Plains, farmers would sometimes tie one end of a rope to the back door of their farmhouses and the other around their waist as a precaution before going out to the barn to attend to the animals. They knew the stories of farmers who, on the way back to the house from the barn in a whiteout, had become so disoriented that they couldn't find their way back home. They would wander off, and their half-frozen bodies wouldn't be found until spring, when the snow melted. That day, Bishop Dalrymple, sweat dripping from the end of his bulbous nose, tied a rope around my waist that was long and enduring. How did he know the number of times that I would stretch the rope to its breaking point, or how often I would drift onto the plains in a whiteout and need a way to find my way back home? And so as we leave today, and the same message that I speak to women everywhere on the planet who are doing kingdom work is the one I say to you. When you don't feel ready for the call and you don't feel like God is active and listening and you're longing for something more, here's the thing that we can do. We can be rope tiers. Tie ropes around people around you's waist so that they can find their way back home. Father God, we thank you so much for the fact that you know the depth of our heart and you love us the same. That is no small thing, and we honor you. Thank you that you have renamed us, that you have recalled us, that we no longer are defined by what society would tell us, but that you bring us in to being empowered and rooted and adopted and loved and filled and sent. Thank you that you as God have created us as your people, and you care to be present with us and shape us and transform us. We thank you for the nations. We thank you for those who are serving the nations. We thank you for our neighborhoods and for the people who live very next to us. Thank you for the people whose cubicle sits next to us at work or whose office we visit. And we pray together that you equip us to be the kind of believers that are tying ropes around other believers' waists so that they can find their way home back to you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Jesus, my Father, the CIA, and me.
And who's the lady in the picture?
Okay, so that is Samson's wife. She was horrified to be in this picture. Victoria is her name. What's really interesting is I did not know her until I was probably 20. And because they lived out of the city, and Samson would come in with these preachers from rural areas, and I got to meet her. Really interesting little bit about this picture. My family took this when they were in South Africa in 2016. I did not get to go on that trip, and they all went to church together. And it was really precious for my son and my daughter to be in the presence of these two men particularly who had shaped my world in ways I can't even quantify.